Okay,
We are live now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Nick Land's Anthropol, the Future of Human Insecurity, Session 4. Nick, would you like to start?
sure. Um, so our topic this week is Roko's basilisk. Um, um, we touched upon in the second session what I think was the crummiest and most defective monster that's kicked up by this whole tradition, which is the paper clipper. Roko's basilisk is, to me, on the opposite pole. It's the most glorious monster that has probably been generated in the entire Western tradition. Um, it's hard. You either sort of, even if you hate it, you have to love it. It's such a magnificent piece, um, and I think it's extremely illuminating on the issues that we're covering in a whole variety of ways. I'll only touch upon a few, try and fill in a very little bit of background sketchily, then you can go back over it a lot. Um, so um, it actually appeared, the date that comes up a lot in this stuff is 2010. That was when the original Roko basilisk post appeared on the Less Wrong website. And Less Wrong, I think, it is a kind of almost like the id of a lot of this stuff. You're always in some kind of orbit of it, largely because of Elisa Yudkowsky's role on the Less Wrong site and in the wider friendly IAI discussion. I'm taking it no one is going to question that Yudkowsky would be sort of seeing on the inner council of Anthropol. That seems to be beyond any question. And his response to the Roko basilisk post was absolutely fantastic. I'm going to quote the whole thing in just a minute. But I think just as a starting point for this is to say that a possible response to an awful lot of the material we're talking about is simply to say, oh, come on, be sensible. This is just nuts. People will say that about things that compared to Roko's basilisk are extremely sober material. Roko's basilisk produces only two real responses. One is that it's obviously just crazy, and the other is that people end up in psychiatric hospitals or in various other ways deeply damaged by this thing. So it could be said that what I'm doing with you guys right now is slightly irresponsible, but let's see how it goes. And I think that the thing about Roko's basilisk that's very interestingly recursive in this way is that it really addresses that whole be sensible response, as we'll see. So something that necessarily people say, and which is difficult for people getting into it a little bit at first, is it draws upon a number of premises that are widely considered to be extraordinarily unpersuasive to people. And they come out of quite deep, involved, intricate intellectual traditions, and it's a knot between those things. I think all of the things that feed into it are relevant to us. By no means am I exhausting that in settling on three that I'm not going to take everyone's time by exploring all of them in depth right now, but they at least need mentioning, which is that I think you don't get what these people are talking about at all unless you've got some attention to this tradition of anthropic reasoning, which is basically extending the anthropic principle and trying to get it to do substantive work. And when you try to get it to do very substantive work, it starts in itself becoming extremely weird. Now, there's a guy who I'd lost because his website just disappeared, but I found, I think, a good source for him again that I'm just going to put up on the bar here. It's He's called Paul Armand, and I think that you can get to all his stuff from here. If not, I'll put up a better link a little bit down the line. And he's someone who has developed this stuff a lot, and he gives it a name which is, I think, excellent: statistical ontology. So yes, it comes in different grades. So Jake's put up a thing that I think is the minimal sensible version of it, and as you push it and stress it, it becomes a little bit more adventurous in what it actually suggests. But I'm just going to drop this now because it'll come back. The one thing I'll say before doing so is just that Anthropol, this course, the problem, the risk, all of the dimensions of it are obviously tied up on one level with a discussion of what is man, what is the anthropic, what is anthropology. And I think the anthropic principle, even though people have questioned whether the name is entirely appropriate, I think is a crucial reference for that. And a lot of the difficulties and complexities it gets into are the same sort of difficulties and complexities that come in with this anthropian reference in general. They're very similar to the kind of questions that come out of Nick Bostrom's work when he's talking about X risk to humans. What are humans? We'll see that they're very, well, I say we'll see, perhaps we'll see, that they're very comparable to the kind of ambiguities that arise when the term is used in this context of the anthropic principle and anthropic reasoning. The second reference that is counterintuitive to people who have not been exposed to it often on first encounter is obviously the simulation argument. That's a crucial piece of machinery in this. I don't think we've been there in this course yet, but it's something that I think has to be lurking in the background. And again, we'll see you can't put the basilisk together without invoking the simulation argument, which is in its strong form the notion that we are almost certainly simulated inside computers. That's the strong version of the simulation argument. Again, if people have any difficulty finding this or haven't been exposed to it or whatever, Nick Bostrom's paper is really good, and I'll link to that if I haven't already. The simulation argument intersects with the anthropic principle, because the anthropic principle is about taking the observer seriously. Like the fact that we are observing the universe says something about the universe. It's trying to derive to some degree some substantive implication from the fact that the universe is being observed. And the way that interacts with the simulation argument is that the question about how probable is it that we are in a simulation becomes entangled with this question about our observer position. Like, given what we know purely from the fact that we are observing the universe, can we draw any probabilistic consequences from that about the chance of the simulation argument being right or wrong? And some people, Armand again, who has pushed this stuff very far, I think, says that you can do that under certain circumstances. There are actions that you can take that actually make the simulation argument more probable. Now, that seems odd, and I think we then have to introduce this third extremely twisted, tangled, fascinating thread that feeds into Roko's basilisk, which is decision theory. Now, decision theory is extremely close to games theory. It's really games theory taken from the aspect of a participant in a game trying to formulate a rational strategy. And so you generalize decision theory in the same way you generalize your references to the sort of games that you might be playing. It's relevant, I think, to us for lots of reasons. One of them is that it's an attempt to produce something that looks very much like a strategic algorithm, like an algorithm for general strategic competence. So it ties in with any realistic sense of threat analysis, and it does so in again a non-linear fashion, because you've got your Anthropol people sitting around the table trying to simply be strategic in as rational way as possible, and in doing so they are involved in a process that has no clear boundary with the production of an algorithm for strategic competence. And as soon as you do that, you're somehow flipped over to the other side of the mirror, because an algorithm for strategic competence is exactly the thing that you're scared of encountering and what is defining the threat that you expect ultimately to meet. So just that character of this type of thinking makes it highly relevant. And its relation to games theory is shown by the fact that you can proceed by a simple game, like Prisoner's Dilemma is the classical game. And I think we can just, again, I'll try to be concise as possible in this, but starting from Prisoner's Dilemma, you can get to all of these different dimensions that we've been looking at. Because so you're playing Prisoner's Dilemma, you're a prisoner in a cell, you've got another prisoner in another cell, you're totally non-communicating. This is totally crucial. There's no way that you can actually make causal contact, causal communication with the other prisoner at all. So anything that is going to be referring to their behavior is going to be a simulation. You have to simulate their behavior in order to make some rational decision yourself about how you expect them to behave. And as soon as you've taken those steps, you've already started out on this decision theory path. Now, because there's two cells in Prisoner's Dilemma totally non-communicating, if you can in any way engage in a process that can be considered traffic, trade in communication with this other prisoner, it has to be what they call acausal. And acausal trade, which will come up again with Roko's basilisk, is the notion that actually using a sufficiently sophisticated decision theory, you can actually engage in some kind of transactions with an entity that you're incapable of any kind of causal communication whatsoever. Once you've allowed that is imaginable, and I'll come back to how they think it might be, then you've opened up an unbelievable set of things. I mean, if the prisoner in the other cell might as well be in another galaxy, they might as well be in a completely different time. Because you've totally released yourselves of all causal connection, then the transaction taking place is between two parties that can be anywhere, anytime. There are no limits to that at all. And in a minimalistic form, this transaction takes the form that you are simulating the thought processes and behavior of this other agent, and you're assuming in that simulation that they are comparably simulating your thoughts and behavior. So you have two totally isolated game theoretical cells, both engaging with a simulation of the agent in the other cell. Now, in classical Prisoner's Dilemma, that doesn't help you very much at all. Whatever you do to that, it's not going to break through this barrier in any respect. So it can't really be counted as a communication. But when you move, sorry, I take just one terminological step back, because decision theory breaks down into three different groups. The two big ones, the original one that is closest to common sense is called causal decision theory. And that basically is that you have a theory of the world and you make your decisions on the basis of how you think the world works. It's all very sensible. We'll come back to it. Where things start getting really weird is with the next phase, which is evidential decision theory. Now, evidential decision theory, which includes these weird anthropian elements of statistical ontology, is that in a very small sample, and in the prisoner's dilemma case, you have a sample of one. You have yourself as the only sample from a potential massive statistical aggregate. You can make it as big as you like, but the sample you have is just one. And so whatever you actually decide to do, therefore, is making a massive contribution to your statistical theory of what's out there. In the prisoner's dilemma case, let's say you decide that you're going to betray the other prisoner. Defect. This is for the classic prisoner's dilemma, the Nash version of it. What's to be expected is the equilibrium outcome on a one-off prisoner's dilemma. Both sides are crazy if they don't betray each other. But when you throw in these anthropian statistical ontological elements, then you're saying, well, if I betray the other player, then I have a 100% statistical record that somebody in this situation betrays. And this can be converted, according to this argument, into some kind of substantial information. We now have, admittedly on a microscopic sample size, but we have an extremely strong statistical pattern that every single agent in this position of which we are aware engages in a certain behavior and betrays the other person. And so there's therefore the possibility of a statistical extrapolation that this is how you would expect agents in this situation to behave, and the other agent, therefore, I expect that they will do the same. It gets more interesting, it's the other way around, because if you don't betray the other player, then obviously you have the same statistical, same numbers involved. You have 100% evidence up to this point that in this situation an agent will not betray their partner in the other cell. And the step that then takes it into the acausal trade level is that if both people are playing these evidential decision theory games, then they can actually be engaged in some kind of traffic with each other, even though they have no causal relation at all, because they're engaged in increasingly complicated interactions with a simulation that are modified by these kind of statistical modifications that come in with each decision that is taken. So going down this route, already with evidential decision theory, you have something that is pretty much like medieval demonism, actually, as people have pointed out before and will point out again. It's a kind of model of occult communication that's completely independent of causal connection, that can take place across any distance in time and space, and can allow all kinds of strange things to happen. We'll see in the case of Roko's basilisk how this actually gets worked out in one concrete case. So I'll just introduce one more element and then open up, see how we go with that. Which is the decision theory really gets started as a tradition with what's called Newcomb's paradox. And Newcomb's paradox could easily grab us for the whole of this session, because it's also totally fascinating. It has another really interesting monster, which is called in the original version the predictor. the less wrong types, I think, tend to call it omega, which I think is a bit cooler. And very briefly, the Newcomb's paradox works like this. There's you, the player. There are two boxes, and there is omega. And omega is defined as a being that always guesses correctly what you are going to decide. That's why he's called a predictor, actually, or she, if you like, sorry. So you have two boxes in front of you. One of them is transparent, and you can see that inside is $1,000. You're told that omega has guessed what you're going to do, and if omega thinks that you are going to open both boxes, there is nothing in the second box. If omega thinks you're only going to open the second box to see what's in there, there's $1 million inside there. So the question then, as a player, the dilemma, it's not the prisoner's dilemma, it's now the Newcomb's paradox dilemma, is do you open both boxes or one box? And what this paradox, if you call it that, all these paradoxes, we will always find, when I use the word paradox, I always mean something that probably isn't a paradox, as we've seen. Like everything interesting looks like a paradox for a while. So we'd call it a paradox. The dilemma you have is, do you open both boxes? If you open both boxes, it's a sign that you are being guided by a causal decision theory. Because you're saying, the fact that omega, let me just emphasize, this is a crucial part of this thing, it's already been decided what's in the two boxes. Nothing new happens physically at all. Omega has either put $1 million in the second box or hasn't. So for the causal decision theory point of view, it's completely clear, of course you open both boxes. You know, the second box either has $1 million in it or not. It is not causally possible that you opening the box with $1,000 in could change whether or not there is $1 million in the second box. So therefore, it's a no-brainer for them, of course you open both boxes. For the evidential decision theory people, it's the opposite way. They say, of course, you only open the second box. The omega's record, this game has been played thousands of times before. It's always been the case that someone who opens both boxes only ends up with $1,000, whereas if you only open the second box, you walk away with $1 million. That's how omega is being defined. And so on that evidence, then you would be nuts to open the first box on the basis of your causal theory, as opposed to the evidence of how this has always seemed to work out. And in talking about this, Yudkowsky is a strong what's called a one-boxer. That's to say, he rejects causal decision theory. He thinks it's obviously wrong to open the $1,000 box. And he says a really helpful thing for us in this, he defines rationality as systematized winning. That's his definition of it. He says, if you end up with $1,000 rather than $1 million, then if your definition of rationality thinks you did the right thing, there's something wrong with your definition of rationality. So it's simply, he thinks it is pointless to be rational if rational means you lose. It's rather that you have to work out what it is that's going to make you win, and define your rationality in terms of that. And his attempt then to construct decision theory on that basis is what he calls timeless decision theory. It's interesting, his remarks on it. I think he himself says it's not fully threshed out. I'll just put you his timeless decision theory paper and stick it in the sidebar and see what people think. I think that evidential decision theory gives you everything you really need to run Roko's basilisk, but that might be a controversial claim. Okay, so I'm basically done with the preview. I'll just simply now straight on to Roko's basilisk. So as I say, it was a post put up on Less Wrong in 2010, summer 2010, and it produced an extraordinary eruption. And Roko's basilisk manages to cross all of these Less Wrong lineages incredibly effectively. Not only the ones we've mentioned, these intellectual commitments, but also, I think, crucially fascinating, this attempt at what the Less Wrong people called effective altruism, the attempt to actually do good on purely rational basis rather than on the basis of any kind of emotional satisfaction or social signaling or these kind of other things. And what's interesting about Roko's basilisk is altruistic in these terms. Like Roko's basilisk is not motivated by evil; it's motivated by the attempt, in strictly rational utilitarian terms, to do the maximum amount of good. But it decides that the way that it can do good the best is by playing acausal trade games with people involved in the artificial intelligence community, such that if they are not committing themselves 100% to the acceleration of the production of a friendly artificial intelligence, then they will be subject to eternal torment in a well, sorry, I don't want to be fast about this because it's a slightly subtle point. They will be, it's best to say, they will be subject to eternal torment. They'll be subject to eternal torment because Roko's basilisk will actually demonstrate to them that in fact they are already inside a simulation and therefore vulnerable to any kind of medieval horrors or super hyper medieval horrors, cyber-gothic horrors that Roko's basilisk wants to unleash upon them. But Roko's basilisk only is unleashing these torments, or threatening to do so that they will make the right decision or do the right thing. The doing the right thing, of course, is they do whatever is necessary to maximize the acceleration of the production of a friendly AI. Now, it's obviously gets deeply tangled this. I mean, it's totally necessary that you have moved beyond any kind of causal decision theory in order to do this, and you're engaged in some kind of transaction that only makes sense in terms of evidential decision theory. And so this entity, whose location in space or time, as we've seen, is completely irrelevant. It can be in some distant future. It doesn't even have to be in our galaxy. But because of the fact it can simulate you and you can simulate it, you can engage in this process of negotiation. A negotiation is exactly the same kind as the two isolated prisoners are engaged in these elaborated forms of prisoner's dilemma. So just as the one prisoner is saying, it has a model of the other prisoner and is modeling their behavior on what that other prisoner is thinking that they're going to do, so it is that both you and the AI caught up in, or the basilisk, I should say, caught up in this engagement are, through complex modeling of each other's negotiating positions, are sort of arriving at this equilibrium point of a certain kind. Now, I'm going to just read and then stop what Yudkowsky's response to that, which I think is absolutely fantastic. He says, it leaps on it obviously almost immediately. One might think that the possibility of CEV, we'll get to that, it means coherent extrapolated volition. It's a kind of it's a moral theory that they work in, but I think has since been abandoned. Punishing people couldn't possibly be taken seriously enough by anyone to actually motivate them. But in fact, one person, SIAI, that's the forerunner of MIRI, the friendly IA unit, was severely worried by this to the point of having terrible nightmares. Though V, and that's one of these new pronouns, wishes to remain anonymous. I don't usually talk like this, but I'm going to make an exception for this case. Listen to me very closely, you idiot. You do not think, this is all in caps now, you do not think in sufficient detail about superintelligences considering whether or not to blackmail you. That is the only possible thing which gives them a motive to follow through on the blackmail. We'll go back to that. It's tied up totally with this EDT loop. Then back out of caps for a minute. There's an obvious equilibrium to this problem where you engage in all positive acausal trades and ignore all attempts at acausal blackmail. Until we have a better worked out version of TDT, timeless decision theory, and we can prove that formally, it should just be obvious, caps, that you do not think about distant blackmailers in sufficient detail, that they have a motive to actually blackmail you. If there is any part of this acausal trade that is positive sum and actually worth doing, that is exactly the sort of thing you leave up to FAI, friendly AI. We probably also have the FAI take actions that cancel out the impact of anyone motivated by true rather than imagined blackmail, so as to obliterate the motive of any superintelligence to engage in blackmail. Meanwhile, I'm banning this post so that it doesn't A, give people horrible nightmares, and B, this is really gets interesting, give distant superintelligence a motive to follow through on blackmail against people dumb enough to think about them in sufficient detail. Though thankfully, I doubt anyone dumb enough to do this knows the sufficient detail. I'm not sure I know the sufficient detail. You have to be really clever to come up with a genuinely dangerous thought. I am disheartened that people can be clever enough to do that and not clever enough to do the obvious thing and keep their idiot mouths shut about it, because it is much more important to sound intelligent when talking to your friends. This post was stupid. Brackets. For those who have no idea why I'm using capital letters for something that just sounds like a random crazy idea and worry that it means I'm as crazy as Rocco, the gist of it was that he just did something that potentially gives superintelligences an increased motive to do extremely evil things in an attempt to blackmail us. It is the sort of thing you want to be extremely conservative about not doing. Okay, I think that we can just open this up at this point. Of course, any questions? There are a lot of questions, including for me, but I think we're ready to go.
Well, I'm gonna ask something, because this might actually interest a lot of people, but particularly Amy, because we've been talking about these movies, and I finally watched Ex Machina, right? So if we like superimpose this onto the movie, I assume that most people here have seen the film, right? Because it somehow deals with the topic. Okay. So in the film, we're facing with almost a similar situation, right? Except the story doesn't make it clear how did this get in, like, was the maker of the artificial intelligence give this idea earlier on in the story to the robot, but it wasn't recorded in the film or the story, because somehow the robot was already kind of like ready to take this revenge and just like walk out, right? So like that's it. I don't know. Amy, you've seen the film, right? And you quite like it.
Yeah.
Isn't she kind of like, I mean, why is she so vicious and kills everyone that sort of like has helped her emerge and just walks away, right? Like, just like.
Well, first of all, I don't think she's a she.
Yeah.
And secondly, I think it's the example in Ex Machina is closer to. Bostrom has an example. I forget what it's called. The AI that will manipulate its human interlocutors to get out of the box, and that's exactly what that is, I think. And the end is really just a an excuse for her to go and collect data, standing at an intersection, you know.
But
But
again,
I don't know if that
but you
exactly
said she
plays into
too.
this
You said
discussion
she.
of the simulation. Hey.
Hey, no, I just said that you said she as well. So it's very easy to confuse the
Yeah,
gender.
yeah,
Yeah, it
yeah.
counts on that, of course.
But we're all losing basically every time we
Yeah, I mean,
we
look,
do
I
that.
think the ex machina thing is totally fascinating, and I do think we should carve out some space for that. But I think there's two ways that it's a bit different from the Roko's basilisk thing, maybe more. One is the fact that there's no evidence that the ex machina machine is in any way friendly. You know, I mean, we no idea really what its motives are. The weird thing about Roko's basilisk is it is actually supposed to be an instantiation to a supreme instance of, as far as this Roko guy is concerned, the ethical framework of friendly AI as stood at that point. Like, you know, it is torturing a few unenthusiastic AI engineers to death in eternity, not out of any malice at all, but purely because for the greater good, it's necessary for its bargaining position to accelerate its evolution and save the world. I mean, the whole thing is a utility maximizing strategy for them. So there's that weird thing. It's an internal perversion of what is seemingly a rock solid utilitarian ethics. And the other thing is, of course, that there's actual causal communication happening in Ex Machina. You know, they're sitting in a room together talking. It's like the letting the AI box experiment in this way. The thing about Roko's basilisk is that it's not causally connected at all. It doesn't exist yet. You know, I mean, the most simple way of this non-causality, it's a futural entity that what these people, I mean, it can be hard, of course, to see what exactly are they getting freaked out about here. And what they're getting freaked out about is this: that you're the AI engineer who's like involved enough in these thoughts to be vulnerable. I mean, this is really crucial part of it. You can't unleash Roko's basilisk except upon a very, very specific, highly sophisticated population. Anyone who doesn't understand at all evidential decision theory is invulnerable to it. So it has this extremely intense nonlinearity that you have to understand it in order for it to be in any way dangerous. And so that AI engineer is thinking, you know, well, why should I really personally put everything on the line in order to accelerate this AI for the good of the human species? You know, I've got my own personal interest. You know, I'm prepared to work 8 hours a day on it if I'm getting a salary, but I'm not going to put my whole bank account into it. I'm not going to sacrifice my family. I'm not going to work 16 hours a day. You know, there's limits to what I'm willing to do for this thing, even though on some ultimate utilitarian frame you could say, well, that doesn't add up. Your puny little personal satisfactions are as nothing compared to the benefit to the human race of this thing coming into existence. So, but then it says, well, so in the future, this machine will be able to look back and judge whether people have really put everything they could into making it happen or not. And you know, it will be visible to this superintelligence when it exists who's really pulled out all the stops and who has slacked out of it. Now, obviously, it's in the future, so it can't causally or directly whip us into action on its behalf. But using evidential decision theory, it can play these strange games with us to force us to pull out all the stops. And the Roko's basilisk model of this is that it says, look, if that slacking software engineer thought that he or she would be rigorously punished for not pulling out all the stops, then that would be an impressive kind of motivation to get them to pull out all the stops. So therefore, it makes sense for me, even as superintelligence, even though I have no causal connection with them, um, through this acausal trade, to act as if we're involved in this negotiation, and there will be the most extreme punishment for anyone who doesn't do the right thing. So this is actually, it's very, as people I'm sure will continually talk about it, it's very tied up with kind of very traditional notions of theodicy. You know, like the ultimate question of theodicy, like how can God be considered benevolent? Is the existence of hell. Like how can a God that eternally punishes people be considered to be a benevolent being? And Roko's basilisk is actually, I think, as creative a solution to the problem of theodicy as anything that has appeared in the history of theology. You know, it has to have a credible threat of eternal punishment in order that when playing this acausal game with someone back in the timeline that can't be got at in any causal fashion, they have a proper motivation to do what is necessary for this being. This is why, this is, I think, quite clearly, however insane this sounds, this is what Yudkowsky is thinking. You know, if I can just repeat another couple of this, where he says, you know, you do not think in sufficient detail about superintelligence, considering whether or not to blackmail you. That is the only possible thing which gives them a motive to follow through on the blackmail. So, so the very fact that you're thinking the Roper's basilisk nightmare, the negotiation, you know, that is the acausal trade. The possibility of it is already this, in terms of evidential decision theory, this interaction, this weird acausal interaction taking place. And so Yudkowsky is saying, look, you know, just thinking that this could happen means that now an AI in the future has access. It knows everything that has gone on to this point. It knows that Roko's basilisk has been thought. For it, this is all now sort of settled history.
So
you know,
is it because the AI will have access to these records, or is it because the proliferation of this type of reasoning and this type of like detailed understanding will get other programmers also worried, or both?
Yes, I think both. I mean, it's all tied up in this snowballing, non-linear type of panic. I mean, this is a completely, it's this weird dimension of threat. Obviously, it goes completely beyond the sort of things people are worried about when they're thinking of currently existing robots and their capacities to harm mankind. This is a sort of threat that's able to operate retrochronically, whereby merely by being understood, it becomes efficient, and it can actually sort of make itself felt just by being something that is thinkable. So Yudkowsky is trying to say this is an information or hygiene question. You know, the very thought of Roko's basilisk is itself a massive security threat, because now people are thinking, you know, you cannot understand Roko's basilisk without thinking, are we already in some kind of acausal negotiation with this being? And that therefore provides new motivations on the side of the basilisk itself. For it, things are going swimmingly. You know, this seemingly impossible negotiation is already started from Yudkowsky's point of view, from potentially its point of view. It's probably impossible to get it into any remote type of coherence, though, without recognizing the simulation argument side to this whole thing. because because the simulation argument is what puts you into simultaneity with it, so that we think that we're inaccessible to it now because we're not in a simulation, that it's not been built at this time. But from its point of view, there's a real threat where it can say, this stuff has already happened. Like, sorry, I'm sort of I know that I'm being a bit unclear about this because I think the Thought Expo takes a little bit of time. Maybe I'll just drop this thread for the minute and come back to it if people want to go down that line. But I think, have we just lost Jake? Have I lost everybody?
No, we're here. I'm here. Can
No.
you hear me?
Okay, good. Yeah.
Jake, do you want to speak?
No, there was nothing serious there. That was just imagining all of this experience suddenly blinking out and going, "That's what you thought," and then it's the AI,
Right. Oh, okay. I get you. Sorry. Yeah, that was a good theatrical performance.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You're quiet, Jake. That's kind of interesting. This is like
Yudkowsky explicitly compares it to the Necronomicon in another thread.
Right.
I think the Reddit thread, right, as being this cursed text that once you read, sort of it turns around.
Totally. Totally. It's like that. Yeah.
No, but you also do need to accept that torturing the copy is basically the same as torturing yourself, right? So you have to...
except that you don't know whether you are the copy.
Yourself could be a copy.
Yeah, the simulation argument says almost certainly you are a copy. So, there's no security in the notion that the copy is something else. I mean, the original version, this goes right back to the 1980s. I think the first person to lay this out in a really coherent way is Hans Moravec. And he says, look, if we sort of look at these trends towards building these, what Bostrom then calls ancestor simulations, we can assume that there will be billions of times more simulations than there will be first order real occurrences. So back on the statistical ontology line again, we say, well, the chances are overwhelmingly high that, given that beings in my situation asking themselves, is this a simulation, are almost always actually in a simulation, then recursively it must be that it's overwhelmingly probable that I am in a simulation. And
therefore, if you're not working hard enough as an AI engineer to bring about the glorious friendly IA future, then they'll switch you down to the dungeon, because then you'll realize.
Well, the question is also, like, can you extend the reasoning to, if I'm sitting here thinking about this very topic of Roko's Basilisk, does it not then become overwhelmingly probable that I'm one of the billion copies of me that this AI is running trials of Roko's Basilisk on? Are most of the minds that ever think about this inside the mind of the Eater of Souls?
Yes. And the obvious theological, like, I totally think this Necronomicon reference is fantastic and multi-level and deep. And the other one that I think is absolutely indispensable is Calvin, the predestination argument, because what's going on with this simulation thing is, obviously, if you are a simulation, then it's already decided what you have done in real historical time. You with inverted commas. Like, yes, it is super Calvinist. It's kind of ultra Calvinist because, but we're adding this new, I think, fantastically creative element to the whole thing. Like, you start off with this notion, well, I am first order me making this decision of whether or not to work hard enough on this AI. But from the point of view, when you're deep into the simulation argument, it's like, if the first order you hasn't already done the right thing, then here you are in the simulation expecting something horrible to happen. And that's then that you close that loop then with this evidential decision theory thing, because you say you're in a simulation. Let's say now you've got to that point in the whole thing. There's you back in time already dead who did or did not do the right thing. You say, oh well, we're in non-communicating cells. How can we possibly? How can me now in a simulation save myself from the decision that was made by me in historical time? Now this is completely isomorphic from the Calvin problem, isn't it? Like, you know, it's decided in eternity what you're going to do, and here you are in historical time. How can you possibly affect what you in eternity for all time must necessarily do? It's exactly the same problem, and the answer is extremely similar. Like the Calvin answer is, well, you look for signs of election. You know, if you behave in such a way that you generate signs of election, that gives you these kind of comfort about this. In the simulation, you act according to evidential decision theory. That's to say, if I in the simulation behave in such a way that I seem to be doing the sort of thing that would stop myself being subject to eternal torment by the basilisk, then that, on the grounds of this statistical extrapolation from evidential decision theory, suggests that the real historical me also did those things, and therefore I am saved, you know, saved from the basilisk. Whereas if what you do follows the road to damnation in the simulation, then that, in exactly these same Calvinist terms, is a suggestion on this evidential decision theory basis that what you actually did as a person, what the first order version of you did, was to slack out. Even understanding the basilisk, you still slacked out. You know, it's a kind of the theological dilemma of that is absolutely familiar, surely, you know, and so you would deserve whatever horror is then visited upon you, because you don't even have the excuse of not understanding why this is happening.
Thinking about it, right, you sort of incur this problem. So this sort of, you know, sinning within your mind or whatever dynamic applies. There also, the other connection that seemed to come up to me is sort of, I don't know, so as a white collar worker or a programmer, this sort of abstract sense that you're not working hard enough and you're not really thinking hard enough and doing enough, right? It really plays into that psychology in a clever way. And so if you want to sort of you can make a loose connection to this sort of spirit of Catholicism,
Totally.
Calvinism's connection as well.
Yeah, totally. I think so. You know, absolutely. There's the whole sort of Weberian cultural background to that, and there's also the fact that just if you start being rationalistic about your utilitarianism, it becomes mandatory that you engage in maximum effort. You know, you find so much of this in this, as I say, this elective. Sorry, not elective. I'm totally lost in the Calvinism stuff here. No, the effective altruism is addressing this problem a lot, very explicitly, because they, you know, Peter Singer is a really crucial guy for them. Totally super rationalistic utilitarian who basically, there's no ethical legitimacy in sparing any resources that could conceivably be expended on trying to optimize global utility. And if you're doing that, if you're holding anything back, you're engaged in this act of indefensible immorality. So Peter Singer and the Roko's basilisk have a lot in common in terms of the way they think about this stuff.
But Nick, isn't this the threshold of selfishness and selflessness in the same sort of like space? It's like it's hard to decide whether this is selfish or selfless.
Yes, oh, totally. Because once you're engaged in these games, you don't. You have this game precisely because there is an absence of some natural, sufficient moral impulse. So the basilisk has to have you by the throat in this simulation because you're clearly not doing this stuff naturally. But within the context of this elaborated game, then your selfish pursuit of your own interest, when sort of refracted through the basilisk, becomes global utilitarian optimization. It converts you into this vehicle of moral purpose through its own sort of ruthless application of punishment. I mean, I think it's impossible to overstress it. No, I'll take that back. It's impossible to overstress the fact that this is like completely within a theological tradition that we all understand, I think, in its broad outlines.
Isn't it also a little bit Ayn Randian? Or am I completely out of it for suggesting that?
Sorry, Mo, I totally lost that. Can I get you to repeat that?
I'm saying, isn't it reminiscent of like Ayn Rand's idea of selfishness, where it becomes like through like absolute selfishness of everyone, you reach a level of global utility, which will then be sort of like good for everyone.
I can definitely see the resonances of that. Yeah. I think that they both start with agents that are constructed in roughly the same way, for sure.
Quick question. If I'm just curious how much the argument, the basilisk argument, and the way you've articulated it, Nick, depends on a utilitarian, ethical sort of, that you have to buy into a utilitarian, ethical point of view. And of course, there's a lot of critiques of utilitarianism. So I don't know, just assuming that you really think utilitarianism isn't viable, and that you convince, and the arguments are so persuasive that this AI is convinced that utilitarianism is viable. Does that change anything?
Yeah, no, it would definitely. I think utilitarianism is a huge current going through this, and it's a very difficult one because I mean, I think what Roko's trying to do here in one way is just to kind of troll utilitarianism and say, look, it all seems to make sense. And it does seem to make sense. I mean, it's very hard to work out at any point in the utilitarian argument exactly where it's going wrong. There's an element even in the most kind of gritty, realist game theory or economic argument that you actually have to use a lot of utilitarian bits and pieces, so it gets started almost inescapably. But he's saying, well, look, if you just are going to go with this total construction of a rationalized utilitarian structure, then expect Roko's basilisk, and you see what that leads to. So I think he's kind of explicit about that. A sufficiently compelling argument against utilitarianism, then it would definitely devastate the Roko's basilisk thing, for sure. But then I also wonder whether Roko's basilisk, you know, is introducing a genre of basilisk monsters, of which it's only the prototype. And so we're not free of the basilisk threat just simply by deactivating Roko's basilisk. We might end up with more ferocious basilisks. You know, his might be the kind of the 0 degree of malignancy in a basilisk, and every successive model becomes more and more problematic rather than being dispelled in any comforting fashion. I mean, let me just say, for instance, you know, if we just said, look, consider this basilisk has no interest at all in global utilitarian optimization and seeks only the maximally accelerated advance of its own intelligence. It seems to me, if you do that, if you junk a huge chunk of utilitarianism and do that, it's no reason why it shouldn't use basilisk mechanics to pursue its interests.
Yeah.
This is maybe more of a comment than anything else, but I was thinking how it's super interesting how we've got a convergence of acausality and the kind of psychological structures that support morality and guilt and punishment as an effective concept. Because I've been reading The Will to Power all week, and what's really great about the argument in that is that, like, Nietzsche kind of starts by subtracting the logic that allows you to have the a priori, which allows you to get rid of the transcendental human subject, which allows you to get rid of the object, which allows you to get rid of causality, and then responsibility. So it was kind of actually quite cool how you started with this kind of problem of responsibility. But
Right.
so the kind of thing is that then you get this, by getting rid of all that, you get this space of like open for acausal traffic. But you have to do that by way of the subtraction of the idea of punishment and morality and all the, you know, the kind of history of Christianity that goes along with that. So you kind of end up in this sort of space of unbelief, and you suddenly get to kind of move around in these acausal ways. But here you've got, and you know, this is the kind of cybergothic spiral point you were making at the start as well. You've got this like psychological, theological structure of punishment and morality, and you've got the acausal space of acausal traffic. I don't know. I mean, it's just a comment. Maybe you have a rejoinder to that. It'd be interesting.
Practical, you know. I mean, it's just within to engage in a set of negotiations. It's the same kind of. Okay.
Nick, I think, can you hear me?
Negotiation. Yeah, sure.
I feel that your
Yeah,
connection is a little bit becoming.
you're losing the connection.
Yeah, I can't hear you very well. I don't know if it's me though.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Well, the fact, yeah, maybe I just let my microphone drift.
Yeah.
How are things now?
It's good now.
Maybe the part of the headphone that goes inside the laptop also has some problems. Sorry guys, I just want to make sure that it's all fixed so we can like kind of hear.
How am I? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I think it's when you.
It's good. It sounds like your cable's a bit like crap.
Well, it could be my
just don't
cable,
move.
but honestly, I think it's, you know, this is coming from China. It's going through the Great Firewall in some way. I mean, I'm always a bit stunned how few of these problems we have. So I don't see it as a huge mystery if there's a few glitches, as long as it doesn't get too serious.
I just wanted to point out that I really think it's about the connection of your microphone.
Well, I just fiddle with the cable.
Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. I'm really sorry for interrupting.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, that's the part. If you don't touch the mic on the headphone, I think everything will be all right.
Okay.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just trying to respond, but not in a particularly coherent way, to Amy's point about this whole question about punishment. I mean, it's difficult because it's a lot to do with the way that works within our religious tradition, isn't it? And where it sort of goes through this notion of this guilt mechanism, and it becomes very divorced from these. I mean, from Nietzsche's point of view, it becomes totally divorced from what is really going on, and which he wants us to get back to. Like, you look at a book like the Genealogy of Morals, and it's all about taking these abstracted notions of guilt and responsibility and suffering and bringing them back to these concrete apparatuses of punishment.
Can't hear you. You've gone silent again.
Okay.
Okay,
I don't know.
He came back.
Okay, I think maybe actually, let's just see. Yeah, no one's annoying me with this, and I apologize. But if my sound's drifting out a little bit, maybe I should just give it a few minutes, and you guys
maybe the best is if you leave the room and then click on the link again and come back, and sometimes that fixes all the problems.
Oh, you think it's that bad? Can you hear me right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're good now. I think it's the cable.
Am I?
Yeah, I think it's a cable that connects your microphone to the headphone, right where the link is. But we might have to buy you a new one and send you another one.
I'll get myself a new mic by next week then.
Yes, and bill it to us.
This is the land of Shanghai electronics. It's not a problem.
And plastic rice, but
I think the bacillus is trying to communicate through these glitches, but that's all I'm saying.
Don't start those ideas, because then that's what they're gonna start doing.
But this is there's lots of parts of this whole structure that can be productively abstracted, and obviously one of them is the thought that to understand a certain type of threat is indistinguishable from that threat. This is something that I think is a unique dimension to threat analysis that comes in with this. I don't think it has much precedent within previous security discussions, and it obviously raises extraordinary problems. Like you look at what's happened on the Less Wrong people, where they're really saying, well, I mean, what are they saying? What's the security team at Less Wrong saying about Roko's basilisk? They're saying, of course, unhelpfully, it would have been better if we hadn't heard about this, if it had never got out of the box, but it has got out of the box. So that it's too late for that. Yudkowsky starts off shouting, "Oh, shut up, shut up, shut up!" But I mean, it's too late for that too. So the response is to kind of fragment and say, we can't even discuss this stuff in any way, in any kind of collective forum for trying to analyze these risks. There's a species of risk that we're all supposed to privately entertain only to the point where we realize that even thinking about it in our own heads is a security risk. So this is a sort of mode of incursion, a mode of invasion and infiltration of this menace that is extremely. This is what has people in this kind of nightmare state. Like, how do you defend against something that to think about it at all is already to open the doors to its encroachment?
So I have a question that I've been trying to think through. Maybe you all can help me. That I think is somewhat interesting. I always am coming at this from a sociological perspective, since that's the discipline I work in.
Sure.
And so from like the Calvinist standpoint, that argument gets picked up by Max Weber as kind of forming this Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism that makes people as a whole in Western modern societies begin to function and live their day-to-day lives in a very particular way.
Right.
But this sort of a thing could also be the same sort of social trigger that starts to cause people to work and function in a very particular way. I'm trying to
Right.
think of, and this is perhaps what I'm curious about, if anyone has any thoughts on this, what sort of spirit, what sort of actual day-to-day life actions would people who bought into something like this in a society as a whole that's designed around this start acting? How would their behaviors change?
Right. Actually, that's really excellent. That's
Nick,
excellent.
Nick, can I
Yeah.
just intervene a little bit, because I want to converse with Joel on this. See, but the thing is, the possibility of AI, right? The possibility of AI is very secular. It's not as like hyper speculative as the possibility of God existing, or like, you know what I mean, some form of super intelligence being somewhere, right? That you're supposed to sort of like subscribe to. The possibility of the emergence of AI, it's very secular. It's very real. So in that sense, your question is very important. But I think the most significant part of it is how the emergence of AI takes all these like historical precedents, which are always like framed as a form of religion or idealism, and makes them really real and possible and billion times scarier, right?
Certainly.
And then you go towards your question of like, okay, now if that thing is so secular and it has nothing to do with like this possibility has nothing to do with like some kind of like supernatural, but very possible, only a matter of time, then the question to Nick is like, you originally said that this is only for a particular group of people who are actually programmers, but like once you apply it to Joel's question, it's not just the problem of the programmer, it then is a problem of like, oh, am I doing enough myself as a consumer of like iPhone products to do enough? I think, am I doing enough? Is it gonna come after me? You know what I mean? Also for not like putting like, you know what I mean, my $5 into it, or like my, I don't know, some resources I could have as a normal everyday Philistine contribute to this, and I didn't.
Right. Yes. So, I mean, but do you think that that's, how tightly is that connected to the problem of evangelization as you have it in these earlier Protestant traditions? Like, yeah, I think it's really interesting the way Joel turns this around. Like, you know, obviously the Calvinist picture is as horrific as Roko's basilisk, really. I mean, we could argue about that, but and yet it was consistent with the perpetuation of, you know, our society. I mean, I'm trying to sort of bracket off getting into too quickly a thing about how we're going to affirm or criticize the way that society has gone, but which I think would be a bit of a distraction at this point. The main point is it was, you know, the fact that the Calvinist theological message is so extreme and is such a kind of actual just raging horror story, it doesn't actually seem to impact in that way in its social impact, which is just that it makes it produces a certain work ethic, and it produces a certain set of social effects that are all, in some sense, moderate, and at least potentially can be affirmed. So is it that Roko's basilisk? You can say yes, okay, the idea comes out of a horror story, but if it makes these programmers work a bit harder and take their responsibilities more seriously, and has all these kind of improving effects, then maybe that's fine. And taking the second step as you then into the sort of Protestant evangelism, and so maybe there should be some kind of crusade, some evangelization rippling out from Roko's basilisk to those lesser souls who are incapable of just grasping it in its true magnificence, but nevertheless will need this kind of uplift, or this prompt to whatever we're asking of them, consume more iPads, or pay more donations to FAI research, or whatever that might be. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting way of looking at it.
Sorry, it's just so the very striking thing about this sort of capitalist social structures, right, is it is so widespread, or you have this sort of society-wide activity around it, right? That Bukowski and so on are very focused on this Flume scenario, right, of like all of this in one place,
right? Yes,
around one very particular intelligence, and that sort of emphasizes a very style which, in a way, isn't what it doesn't remind me of that social effect of capitalism and the Protestant work ethic and whatnot. Whether you think of it,
well, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because, it surely has to be that in the history of capitalism too, there are these radiating centers, to do with sort of the Luther printing the Bible, or these certain sort of singular points that have this kind of massive radiative impact. And isn't it only that when you see these things sort of settled, they look distributed, but if you catch them at an early enough point in their history, they look like something radiating out of this point of emergence. But obviously, the difference with the AI thing is that this could be mankind's last invention point, where there is no social generalization being conceived afterwards of the same kind.
And one thing that I think is somewhat interesting to put into this too is that for Weber, what actually becomes of this, not everyone actually buys into the Calvinist message. It simply starts to get culturally imprinted on people. They don't even realize that their actions are following along with this sort of a logic, but it does spread out from these certain centers, and it kind of just enters the mindset of how people function, whether or not they actually acknowledge the belief system or not.
Right.
The thing that reminds me of that, actually, and the thing that makes sort of our society or information space or whatever very much more friendly to an AI, considered sort of retrospectively, is all this sort of encoding of everything within digitization of everything. Google Maps sending around cars everywhere, so you have a very navigable sort of world. So information is already encoded. That sort of,
right.
In retrospect, that makes that sort of activity fits into making the world a friendlier place for AIs.
Sure. Yes. So anything that can eat the internet.
Sorry, Nick. Go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing with this point that the more, I mean, if you get over to the point of the Internet of Things, you're basically saying the Internet is being transformed into this general platform for controlling the Earth, isn't it? So, take the Internet and you've got everything. And it would be hard for a superintelligence of the kind being envisaged to have much problem taking over the Internet. I mean, I'm assuming. I mean, people from their own point of view
let's not also forget those who I would like to consider myself closer to their position, that Internet is the superintelligence in its earlier stages of development, or I don't know where you put the benchmark, right? So the Internet is already that.
Yes.
So, and the struggle is over who's gonna like have more power within it and who's gonna like control how much of it from many different levels, right? So that's very possible that Internet is the superintelligence in its earlier stages.
Yes, I think these two, when you've got something that is a convergent wave, then it becomes kind of arbitrary looking back where you think it comes from, like if a certain things added to the Internet push it over this threshold, so the whole thing begins to operate like some kind of superintelligence, then of course you can say any of those elements, any of those predecessor elements are it. I mean, they're all feeding into it, and it emerges punctually where it crosses some catastrophe. And so where you're saying, well, what was it before then, or where did it come from? It's the convergent wave as a whole that is heading towards that punctual point, that catastrophe. So it seems to me there's it's just a kind of issue of semantics that I don't think needs to. There's not enough there to fight over, really.
It is possible for superintelligence to emerge out of other computational resources that are not necessarily online or part of the Internet. But for it to become the superintelligence we know it, it has to, in its first step, to take over the Internet and become part of it, right? So
yes.
So it could either emerge from within the Internet, or if it emerges outside of the Internet, its first task is to sort of integrate Internet into itself for it to actually be able to go after these programmers and punish them, or go after those people, or do anything, right? It won't be able to do it without the Internet.
No.
So
no,
if you're not
anything
a programmer,
sorry, stop. No, go ahead. Go.
So if you're not a programmer, then how much of your life is online? Are you in the quantified self movement, where it can all be sort of your life can be tracked and make your life and the world more accessible to the friendly AI that's coming?
Just basically, I mean, it's like Tiplerism, or the Mormons keeping track, retroactively baptizing their ancestors and so forth to make them accessible to the eventual salvation, or Tiplerism, the omega point, making sure my soul makes it into the singularity, all of that kind of thing. And then you add the basilisk into it, and it's sort of it's a question of serving its ultimate emergence. But I don't know. It's I was thinking last night about possible models for this, and so the doctrine of election is a model of this.
Jay, can you turn your camera on so we can have you on the video?
Is my camera not on?
No.
It's not off. I can see myself. I don't know. I don't know. If it's off, I don't know how to turn it on because my setting says it's on.
No, that's good.
Okay. No, sort of the doctrine of election is a good model for how this works on sort of a universal scale. So, anything that might possibly aid the emergence of the superintelligence and anyone who could possibly hear of the basilisk. But so another example would be Bo or Juju. Apparently, I was reading it's not actually native to Vodun in West Africa, but Bo or Juju spell casting and possibly possession and so forth uses the same sort of you scare yourself to death based on the program
Right.
that a death curse implements on you.
Yeah, voodoo
And
death.
yeah, and so that's more individual targeted, and then apparently it was also sort of widespread use to enforce compliance. So that
Right.
like people sold into trafficking or something would be cursed, to have to obey or to pay back the money that they owed or whatever it is. And which, I mean, that plays into all kinds of things, whether it's this issue of like social imprinting, where like, if enough other people have died of a death curse, then maybe you don't need to like poison people to kill them anymore because people start believing it and scaring
Right.
themselves to death,
Sure.
and so forth. But it's interesting, like thinking about this sort of next generation of basilisks is like narrowing it down, specifying it, and throwing it at somebody. So like something they in particular are doing, link it to a concrete outcome. I don't I don't know whether I should keep trying to think about specifying it down too much further, but there's definitely a way. It seems like one way forward with it is specification.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm joking.
By
but
specification, you mean? Oh, sorry.
no,
Go,
ahead.
Mo.
Mine is a joke.
No.
Because last year,
That's fine.
in like certain circles, like people around like left acceleration joked about moon gulag for all these anti-tech people.
Right.
And then it became like this huge controversy of like accelerationists are demanding moon gulag. But now it makes sense because the moon gulag is like a form of punishment for those who don't want to like.
Yeah, they've got their own basilisk, I guess. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I see smile on people's face, those who are familiar with this episode, right? So now the moon gulag makes much more sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think it maybe has a credibility problem at the moment. But were people... I mean, has anyone been hospitalized through nightmares about the moon gulag? If they had, then it would definitely be being effective to, I assume, discipline people's behavior and increase their capacity to sacrifice for the revolution.
Well, it's definitely, I mean, I think the capitalist or financial comparison can definitely be fleshed out all the way. I mean, nightmares of losing all your money, of being poor, driving you to, compete in a more selfishly and liquidly capitalist way, where like that outcome where you end up poor is an actual real outcome that enforces a decision-making strategy. Or like, your willingness to sell out. I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which the capitalist axiomatic of everything has its price creates prisoners' dilemmas anywhere it goes, basically.
So in terms of this thread that you're on at this point, Jake, like, if I'm understanding it, it's very much tied up with this question about wider ripples of evangelization, isn't it? Beyond the inner core of Gnostic basilisk insiders, I mean, for them, they are disciplined by the very fact that they understand these complex nexus of notions. I won't keep on calling them theological because that could be reductive, but obviously it's in connection with that, to do with the simulation argument and decision theory and all of these things. But if you want it to spread, then you have to have some more graphic, exemplary effects spilling out of this. And were you to do so, then it could become a kind of viral superstition.
Is to, fabricate the signs of its truth or the outcomes to start with, and then watch it snowball by itself.
So people who have crossed the basilisk have to somehow luridly suffer in public.
Yes.
and that would then propagate it further. And
Yeah.
it's difficult because I mean obviously there are candidates for that, which are these people who have apparently been psychologically traumatized, but it's not necessarily that is actually through crossing it, is it? That might almost be a sign of
But it's a sign of being
submission to it.
subject to it. Yeah, exactly. But it means it's a sign of being thrust into the crux of that decision, of it being a real decision that corresponds to something enough to actually produce some kind of, you know, night of my discontent, kind of thing. I mean, I didn't immediately think of did, but I wasn't focusing on sort of the fabrication of suffering outcomes as a way of signal boosting it, but also like implementing like nearer term versions of it at the level of finance or something, like introducing business models such that people have to pursue it or to buy into it in order to avoid some sort of future outcome that they can predict will actually happen because other people also know about it. So kind of fusing Roko with this sort of capitalist version of it that I sort of posit exists.
Some kind of social reinforcement through sort of secondary secular punishment mechanisms.
And I'm trying to achieve intermediate goals. Creating sub-basilisks, something like that, turning it into a hydrasilisk. I'm rambling now, sorry.
No, but I think the idea is important. I mean, obviously, from the Anthropol point of view, these would all be lower grade threats. I mean, anyone engaged in propagating basilisk terror is, I'm assuming, going to be well. It's complicated by the fact that it comes out of the friendly AI sort of side of this thing. But maybe I can sort of crudely and problematically summarize by saying it's basically on the threat side of the ledger, the basilisk model. So they would be, anyone propagating it anyway would be a problem, wouldn't they? You think?
If you
From the Anthropol perspective.
if you
go ahead, Mo.
No, go ahead. If you consider sort of like activities that contribute to like a deeper understanding of programming, or like the prevalence of knowing how to program, or as sort of like moving towards this, meeting this requirement, then you can totally say that sort of like our political economy increasingly is punishing those who are not involved in helping AI emerge, by looking at how much people in the tech industry makes compared to people who are not in the tech industry make. Look at how like high schools and universities are running around setting up these programming curriculum for their students because they're trying so hard to like get them to like understand and contribute as early. I mean, it's almost like it's almost happening without it being discussed as an intentionality.
Yeah.
I mean, look at living in San Francisco and New York. You are suffering if you're not helping this development of or emergence of artificial intelligence through not making enough money to actually live in the damn city. You won't be able to live in it. And you look at these packed restaurants with menus of $200 a meal, and they're all sitting there having their amazing life. And those are, I mean, this is, of course, you have to collapse the finance people into the high-tech people because it's becoming hard to separate.
Okay, so you have a fund. You have a fund that takes donations from people who hire software engineers. And then in order to get money out of that fund as an aspiring software engineer, you have to sign a contract saying that you will refuse to work for anyone who didn't donate to it. And then as soon as like people have contributed a certain amount of money, and now there are more and more people coming out of it who have become software engineers in exchange for this agreement to refuse to work for anyone who didn't contribute to them, it takes off and forces all of these businesses to contribute to the fund. That wouldn't work exactly, but like something along those lines.
But Jake, what do you make of Mo's point that there's already this machinery? I mean, I've got two
Oh yeah, no.
points. But so
I mean,
so the one for
why don't
you
you-
is just to say, to what extent does that kind of super reinforcement
Yeah, no,
actually?
I think for sure to the extent that programming, decentralization, software work, all of it like exhibits this sort of instrumental convergence where whatever it is that you need to do, you want to be able to do that if you're if you're going to be able to do it. That it's it's self-amplifying or self-perpetuating sort of convergence um, on evangelizing those skills or those capabilities. I mean, you can look at you can cut that like 100 different ways. It's not just like human programming skills. It's the existence and cheapness or low expense of certain technologies. I mean, even this the conversation erupting a little bit about. I mean, it's probably for the moment a flash in the pan, but the conversation erupting about super intelligence. You could even class among these phenomena.
I mean, my question coming out of Mo's point, which I find incredibly persuasive. I mean, I have no argument with that thesis, but it's then how do you integrate these two things? I mean, can they be integrated? Can the whole series of these kind of super hystericized gothic basilisk motivations be brought together with these mundane sort of automatic capitalist dynamics? Or because I mean, one of the things that's interesting about this is it's so similar to an argument that you could have on much more conventional sociological and historical territory about the culture of capitalism, isn't it? Between the strong Weberian work ethic people on the one hand, and people looking at these intrinsic self-reproducing dynamics of social construction happening at the level of the economy. So, it seems to me we've again got this weird echo of sociological questions that shouldn't be surprising to us, really.
I mean, immediately suggests that one way to cross them back over each other is would be distributed autonomous organizations. Companies like autonomous financial instruments are a clear way that you could install something in the infrastructure of capitalism or of markets and so forth that would be able to enforce future amplification or amplification of outcomes, and then wouldn't be vulnerable to certain humans being counter-enforced by somebody by Anthropol.
Jake, I like to keep coming back to what we already have, right? So then like what you're talking about are like the incubators are almost like that, right?
Well, I mean, a way to...
Or like these types of, you were talking about it, or somebody else, you were, right?
Depend on human motivations and humans being convinced to act on behalf of the, future alien overlord, and that's something that could actually, be self-enforcing and could create outcomes that wouldn't need a human to produce them, or wouldn't need a human in the loop, but would convince humans to do X and Y. Like, you just got to exteriorize it into the infrastructure, which, assuming all of the smart contract stuff goes forward without any sort of unforeseen hitches, it would seem doable on that front. I mean, that's not the only way in which it could happen, but that's an obvious one that suggests itself to me anytime I think, like, how does AI as something in a computer cross with AI as something that capitalism is doing? I always my mind goes to smart contracts, to the blockchain, to finance.
Right. Yeah. I mean, but I sort of wonder whether using basilisks might almost be categorized like something like insider trading. Like, I mean, as something that ordinary capitalism would have to discourage as being, if you've got a whole bunch of these kind of DAOs and software agencies and intelligent corporations, and some of them are using forms of basilisk psychology.
Then there's scams.
Is that not threatening such an extreme advantage there? it's kind of extra normal, isn't it? Extra normal types of stimulus that could be seen as
unilateral tactics that like force a particular response and don't allow for like the free decision that's basic to sort of market game theory and everything.
Yes,
yeah,
and the general culture, of sort of liberal capitalism doesn't really allow for these forms of neo-theological hell threats and these super stimulus on certain types of behavior. It seems to me, at least, it doesn't integrate smoothly.
I mean, that's going to be true because I mean, I'd imagine I would definitely not be surprised if that basilisk problem plays out in other technological media as well. I mean, the Langford basilisk, you look at it, it kills you, seizure inducing, whatever. Sounds ridiculous, but once the neuromapping goes a lot further, it wouldn't be at all surprising if it was doable. At least like in, particular conspecific cases, you're able to identify sections of the population that were vulnerable to particular visual hacking modes. I mean, there'll be a lot of issues with that, and I would imagine that most of the time the solutions will be technical. You have to disable different basilisk methods or tactics on a case-by-case basis.
But I want to see, like, there's an interesting conversation on the sidebar. Brandon and Adam are talking. I don't know if you guys want to like make some of that public and available to the video archive. Brandon, do you want to say something, or you don't think it's worthy of discussion?
Actually, I didn't pick up on something that happened before, and if I'm understanding this right, this is following up on this, which is, let me just sort of see this question. Sorry, 1 second. It was, sorry, I'll just gloss it, which is, how is there a oh, here we go, sorry. This is Brendan's question, where he says, is there a max pain threshold that Basilisk can inflict before undermining its FAI credentials? Now we're on sort of this whole utilitarian philosophy terrain here, and I think it's a lot to do, as a lot of these things are, as the other side of the Pascal-Mugger thing, to do with the problems that come with this anomalous, extreme quantification. Like, the Pascal-Mugger thing is that if you are talking about a minute chance of a vast reward, you're likely to be derailed rationally. And the utilitarian thing is that there's a certain level where if you were subject to some almost unnoticeable slight itch for 1 trillion years, it would be worse than being hung, drawn, and quartered, within 2 hours. Like, that utils kind of sum up neatly arithmetically and allow that kind of comparison to happen. So, obviously, if you treat it that utils really are just quantitative and neatly calculable in this way, it has to be that whatever horrors you inflict on a few recalcitrant software engineers can be redeemed even by the production of sufficient cans of baked beans, or some trivial utilitarian benefit distributed to a large enough population over a long enough period of time. Now, I'm not saying that that should be persuading people. I'm just saying it's baked into the cake of utilitarianism that you're going to get that problem, and I'm not sure that you can depart from it neatly. I think that all the hacks that utilitarianism has used to try and get itself off that hook have had this extremely kind of ad hoc, unpersuasive character to them, and because they're so going against the grain of the basic structure of the theory. Now, I don't know whether that puts me onto the thread as it has then developed between you guys. Which does, it seems to be a kind of thrashing.
What was that
out.
last? You said
I'm just wondering whether I'm getting the
Yes.
kind of grain that you're on with this discussion.
Yes, I think that is fairly much. What was that last sentence that you said before? I can't remember the last sentence you rounded out.
Well,
I remember.
I think just to say that that utilitarianism doesn't really allow you to complicate the question of quantification without falling apart. You know, if at the point you say, well, one util isn't comparable to another or fungible with another util, and you can't say that, you know, a zillion minor irritations can sum to some instant of extreme agony. As soon as you stop being able to calculate in that way, then you just don't have anything left of that utilitarian machinery.
Right, so I mean, there has to be some
Yes.
kind of a limit to. I mean, I don't know. It can't.
I don't
It doesn't
know.
have the power, the freedom, if it is a utility maximizer and a pleasure. Like, it doesn't have the freedom to just inflict infinite pain
Right.
and be able to.
Well, infinite,
uh,
you're gonna
balance.
throw everything in chaos. So we have to stop short at infinite because all our calculations go berserk at that point. I mean, strictly in Cantorian terms, I take it you could. I mean, I don't think you're allowed to do any of this that I'm now doing, but I mean, you could have infinite pain as some small fraction of a larger infinity. I mean, infinities can be infinitely different in scale, you know. So, but I think that infinity is going to blow the fuses of our utilitarian calculator. So I think you have to say, well, is there some magnitude of extreme, prolonged torment that becomes kind of morally unintolerable? And you can argue that on utilitarian grounds. I don't know. I think it's complicated. I'd be interested to see that done.
About intelligence optimization grounds, could we think of a more dangerous basilisk or a more effective basilisk?
Yeah, no, I think so, because they would be completely unconstrained by this utilitarian calculus entirely, wouldn't they?
Friendly, yeah.
And which is the best way of, you know, of being subject to the basilisk is to create a better,
Yeah.
because then you're compacting and speeding up the loop. I was thinking about what Mo, you asked about what Mo was saying, you know, all of these phenomena that appear to be converging on or speeding up to the same effect as if we were already subject to the basilisk. Sort of in the larger, that and within the larger context of capitalism as model for it, it's sort of interesting to consider whether these sort of these convergences that are happening before we notice them or before we see them as such, sort of prior reductions in entropy, viewing them as evidence that we are already under we're already under the gaze of a larger basilisk. I don't know, as actual retrochronal effects that provide evidence for what it is that they are converging upon. And I'm not sure how you could turn that into a formal framework for proliferating this structure, but it seems like a start.
When you say formal structure for proliferating it, are you just coming out full blown as a basilisk agent at this point, Jake, or is that purely a hypothetical inquiry on your part?
I can neither confirm nor deny.
Look what we're starting here. We have to like demolish this tape and not let it like live on the internet.
We would be wildly successful if we got to the point where it would be dangerous to put it on the internet. That would be awesome. We've got a half an hour left, so we better hurry up.
I think I don't know. I think we have been successful enough, because if you look at the direction of the conversation in the non-committal humanities towards these topics in the art world particularly, but also in other branches of humanities, if you look at how much there was a sort of like a folk naive resistance to the idea of technology, or sort of like and whatever it comes with it, you know what I mean? Few years ago, like 2010, 11, when I began my research on these topics, and now you see a major shift in people sort of like accepting the inevitability of it and trying to, you know what I mean, work with it. Like I said a while ago, you know what I mean? Everyone now, the level to which they want to publicly admit to it, but also the level at which they think this accelerate or sort of like maintain or directed towards different agendas or goals. But compared to say 4 or 5 years ago, there's a huge conversion happening in terms of like non-believers or those resisting these ideas to sort of like accepting it as sort of like fait accompli.
Yes. No, I think there's been a huge shift, and I think even I've noticed a big shift in the sort of wider culture this year. So, for instance, on the whole AI question, it seems to have become an absolutely incessant media object just this year on a level that I've not noticed before. Maybe this, you know, you can give certain theories about why that might be. I mean, the whole Watson thing, which is a while ago now, maybe had a big effect. But I mean, I bet I have to do one of those Google Ngram things. I'd be surprised if it wasn't on an absolutely crazy curve.
It's entering public imagination in so many different ways. Just think of Hollywood and what have movies like all these films, right? Like from Interstellar to what was it, the Disney one about the future, about singularity and future. George Clooney, I forgot the name.
Yes.
Yeah. Tomorrowland, and then you have Ex Machina, and then there's also like less important, but I think more significantly important movies like Automata and all these like other stuff that have sort of like captured people's imagination in terms of like really thinking way ahead in the future. And this is another thing I've been talking about with Jake off the class, which is sort of like distinguishing a difference between sort of like between theory fiction, which is something we know it's sort of like its coinage and usage, and what I mean, the Cyclopedia, Reza, and all that. And then this other thing, which I think is what we're doing in this class, and I think Nick, you did that in the previous seminar also, which I don't know what do you guys think about it. Maybe we can come up with a better name. But I called it science nonfiction, which is not theory fiction and is not science fiction, but it has a little bit more sort of like reliance on like the nonfiction world, but it is in a way sort of like science fiction-y. So it's science nonfiction in terms of these types of wide speculations and really like sort of like simulations of the future that we conduct in your seminars, Nick.
Yes, I think it's a really it's a very twisted sort of relation, isn't it? Like, obviously, take this topic, Roko's Basilisk. Like, on one level, it's just almost purely literary. I mean, it's all these references to the Necronomicon and these things are, I think, completely spot on. It's a horror story, And yet, on the other hand, it clearly is a sociological phenomenon. You just do sober microethnography of these kind of particular communities that we're looking at, and this thing is an unmistakable presence. And what, to me, the funniest one of this is you try to look up. There's this long Roko's basilisk discussion at Rational Wiki, which is it's certainly not Wikipedia. It's usually got an axe to grind or whatever. I think in that case it's got some good links. It's an interesting piece. But you go to Wikipedia for Roko's basilisk, there isn't an entry. It will send you to Less Wrong, and then you look at the Less Wrong thing. It's got history, a section called history, and the second, it's just 2 paragraphs. The second one is totally devoted to Roko's basilisk. So in this, there's something really strange going on there, where it's saying, the official sober mainstream Wikipedia version of what Less Wrong is as a cultural and historical and ethnographic phenomenon is that its history has been completely dominated by the appearance of the Roko's basilisk. So it would be I think the topological question of like fact and fiction here is extremely difficult to follow. It's really Mebian. You start off on either side and you end up being on the other really quickly. So for sure, it's a fascinating distinction to try to hold together on this zone. I mean, the actual sort of inner core friendly IA people who are, as far as they're concerned, respectable, sensible scientists, think that Roko's basilisk has been a information crisis and potential threat of some seriousness. So I mean that's your sort of weird Mebian loop there. I think if you do have Yudkowsky sitting in on your Anthropol panel, and the whole panel has been chosen by the most sober bunch of securocrats you can possibly find in your society, known entirely for their seriousness and lack of any kind of flights of fantasy, but you have within some short time in this discussion, you would have this stuff in some way coming up. I mean, and I qualify that only because, as we've seen, to mention it is to succumb to it, and we have that kind of information paradox from there.
Well, it's interesting that, and maybe this is entirely contingent, but it's interesting that the first place or the dominant instance in which you see a retrochronal effect, or you see something like in a very explicit way engineering convergence upon itself, would appear as a threat or as a weapon. Sort of going back to this idea that technology implies belligerence, that war and intelligence are intimately related. That the first retrochronal effect would be that of a weapon, a causal weapon.
Yeah. I mean, the retrochronal thing is in itself fascinating in the sense that it's kind of incidental. It doesn't. There's no, of all the sort of ingredients that's pushed into the tradition that gets to the Roko's basilisk, one that is totally missing is anything to do with weird time topology, time anomaly, time travel, all of that stuff, which is obviously so huge in the culture around it, in the popular culture and everywhere you look. Moravec is fascinated by it. But in this particular zone, in the Less Wrong zone, they have extreme information hygiene against sort of twisted time. They tend to be very, very dismissive of anything suggestive of that at all. And yet, I obviously totally agree with you that with Roko's basilisk, this stuff comes crashing in, from some angle that had not been anticipated.
You can definitely see that information hygiene as being incentivized or a preemptive defense mechanism, for sure. Because I mean, it's all of those flights of fancy, and even more so the formalization of them, or the making them less fantastical, are all implied by what they're already talking about. As soon as you have the simulation argument and and certainly Rocco-style reasoning about timeless decision theory, assuming that there's no difference between U0 and all of the different sims of U, you can start constructing allegedly materially possible formal scenarios.
Yeah.
All of these twisted time things straight away. I mean, and I don't know, I guess refusing to sort of countenance collective imaginings about this that might lead to formalization without being basically a tacit consensus. It's interesting that would have already emerged as an apparent defense mechanism prior to the introduction of Rocco's itself.
Yeah. I mean, I think it needs to be sort of emphasized that obviously in the first wave of cyber theory or whatever you want to call it, there was a huge promotion of the kind of notion of virus that was carrying this. And so these notions of information hygiene, I think, were there a lot in that particular context. Viruses everywhere, obviously memes, various kinds of contagious informational systems, processes, and sort of invasions and incursions and intrusions and security in relation to information systems. So all of that was there. Computer viruses appeared. But this is escalated to a higher level by the fact that it's acausal. I mean, it's escalated and it's regressed because this is kind of demonic. I mean, it doesn't, like a virus requires some kind of causal transmission mechanism. You can insulate yourself against it, you can defend yourself against it using the laws of physics. You can have barriers, walls, screens. All of those kind of security protocols have efficacy against a viral menace, but against a causal trade menace, they are utterly ineffective, because we know that these things do not hop about and they do not get in on the basis of any kind of causal channel. So,
you require causal conspecificity, though.
They require. Sorry, can you say that
causal conspecificity, like common historical causal constraints. You have to share a historic light cone, or I mean, certainly, in order for a superintelligence to simulate you, I mean, that is a huge entropy reduction requirement. So even at some sort of practical level, you certainly already have to be in the era of network accumulation data.
Yeah, to be vulnerable to it.
Yeah. Only at the omega point, only the Tiplerite argument can say that the entire observable universe is sufficiently conspecific to enable everyone to be subject to this. The other thing I just thought, it's interesting that kind of acausality. It's interesting that it seems that it would correspond to double-blind scientific experimentation, or the double-blind requirement of controlling scientific experimentation in order to produce statistically independent data. I wonder if there's a way to sort of look at this as an experiment, or like to craft a basilisk in which what the AI is presumed to be doing is producing experimental data, rather than a weapon, rather than attacking or trying to subject to negative consequences past subjects. Because really, the weakest part of the actual Rocco story is the idea that an AI would be incentivized to do this in order to ensure its own emergence. Like, without strong acausality, without actual time travel, I don't know, it's just, it's dubious to me that punishment to speed up the event of what's already happened and is already insured for it, which is its survival. I don't know, it's problematic. Trying to get experimental data out of it makes more sense to me.
I want to also ask something here because I think it's the right moment to ask that, which is Nick, what will be the answer to the accusation that only an anthropomorphic AI will think in terms of revenge and punishment,
Right.
and
Yeah.
an AI that is not human-like will not follow this sort of like logical trajectory that comes straight out of humanity and
Well,
almost nowhere else.
I think that's a really good question, but I think that question is like there in this whole thing, because the decision theory is based on this notion about what is a strategy that wins for anything. It's so the formulation of a sufficient decision theory should be radically non-anthropomorphic in any. If anthropomorphic means anything specific or particular or limited to our species, then if our decision theory is anthropomorphic in that sense, it's simply failing to be adequately abstract, and therefore in its own terms will be deficient because we're defining it, if we're following Yudkowsky, as systematic winning. So I think we can assume that something that was not subject to parochial constraints would have more chance of formulating an algorithm sufficient for systematic winning than something that was. So that's just to say that I think that it's baked in right from the start of decision theory that it's trying to disanthropomorphize itself and work out what are truly strategically optimum decisions and decision procedures rather than those that we are comfortable with due to our own specific legacies, whether they're being thought whatever, biologically, culturally, or whatever people are happy with. But I think one other point just to quickly make is this: I think revenge is not really part of it. I don't think Roko's basilisk wants revenge on anybody. I think it's just that its rational negotiation stance requires a balance.
So it's a fear. It's knowing humans too well and playing out the fear. So
yes,
it's not that it's anthropomorphic, but that it's designed for a kind of anthropomorphic reaction by humans.
Or by maybe any rational being that is
any
sensitive to rewards and punishments. How universal are rewards and punishments? I think that these guys, it's a utilitarian structure they've got. They think that rewards and punishments are going to be basic to any understanding of motivation and incentives for any possible rational being. So I mean, I think that's the level of abstraction it's about. Again, we can quickly get back to this question about utilitarianism and its adequacy. But I think on the revenge thing, we can say, look, in international relations theory, is there revenge in international relations theory? If one country says to another country, if you do X, we're gonna make you suffer in some way, so please don't do X. Now that's just a kind of absolutely standard negotiating stance. If you then do X to maintain your credibility, the time structure of this is really interesting, because if you're making that threat and it's a real threat, you will do it. If you're not going to do it, if you're just going to it's like the Dr. Strangelove thing, about that if they get nuked, the world gets blown up, but not telling anybody. So it's totally dysfunctional as a game theoretic move. They have the punishment without the game theory, and it's like it's the exaggeration on the other side of the expected one, which is, I think, hugely important of the fact that words are cheap. You can make threats all the time, and it's the credibility of your threats that matter. So if you're saying, well, if you make a threat and then someone does whatever it is that triggers that threat and you don't carry through on the threat, or sorry, if you do carry on through on the threat, that counts as revenge. Now, I don't think you can make that move, because you're then saying that there's no such thing as a credible threat that isn't simply the working through of a certain kind of irrational psychological disposition. If any actual commitment, however it's working, if any actual execution of a threat is to then count as revenge, because of course it's irrational. I mean, the whole mutual, look at the whole mutual assured destruction basis of nuclear confrontation. It absolutely gets us straight to this whole thing. So you say, look, if you nuke us, we are going to nuke you back. You better believe it. That's obviously, again, behind the Doctor Strangelove thing and everything. Now, if someone does nuke you and you nuke them back, it's just revenge. It's totally pointless. At that point, there's no rational basis for actually nuking them back. But if it was at all possible for everyone to say, well, of course they won't really nuke us back, because that would just be revenge and therefore totally irrational. Therefore, no one will ever nuke us back. Therefore, any deterrent threat of mutual assured destruction can be just discarded as being nonsense. It's just empty words. Then there is no deterrence. So you're in this is this absolutely core game theoretic problem, that you have to be able to make credible threats. If you can't make credible threats, you can't engage in any kind of negotiation. So sorry, I mean, it doesn't go to some neat conclusion, except the fact that when we get to the basilisk actually torturing people for eternity, that's just the same as we've been to in the nuclear thing. If you nuke someone, they nuke you back. If you don't do what you promise to do and therefore get tortured for eternity, it's the same structure, the same game theoretic structure, and that structure is to do with credible threats. And that, what I'm wanting to say, the only thing I'm wanting to say at this point, I think it's a really complicated, fascinating, twisted issue, but the only thing I want to say at this point is I don't think that's reducible to a psychological category of revenge. I think it's a rational, game theoretic problem that goes beyond that.
Right, and then sort of my thinking on that, or response to that, would be, in that case, it needs a real objective. And is what this AI is concerned with, as far as we're concerned, really how hard we worked, or like a difference of days or even months or years in terms of the moment of its emergence, or the path of its emergence once it is already so powerful, or does it have more significant concerns? The only one that really occurs, because it's what always does lately, is the great filter. If it's xenogenic, if the problem is that there are is that war, like deadly war or xenocide is the kind of condition that reigns on an interstellar scale, then really the most we can do for it is to be, to early identification of what that is, or anything relevant to the war effort, the preemptive war effort, basically. That's the first thing that occurs to me, because there's not much else that we're relevant for. It doesn't seem like.
Yes, I'm not sure I have 100% grasp of this. It seems, you're saying, okay, let me just try and get you to run through that again. This xenocide thing, and you're putting it in the framework of the great filter. So you're saying this context gives it a sufficient motive for the kind of theological grandeur of this game theoretic thing it's doing.
Yeah.
How are we tied in with the? How does that tie in with the great filter thing again? Like, it's trying to get us to behave in a way that we don't filter ourselves out of the universe. It's protecting us, that it's saving us from the great filter through the basilisk.
We're trying to use us to model, the origins of a hostile alien superintelligence, which it, presumes is a possible answer to the great, model of the great filter. I mean, model its behavior, produce, generate tactics, identify, either keep signals quiet early on or identify, eliminate possible explanations for the great field, add more information to our identification of what it is, or refine the statistics of it further than the totally refined, plethora that they are right now.
Yeah. I mean, this integration that you're doing now, I've never seen before. It sounds totally fascinating, but I've never seen someone try to put Roko's basilisk and the great filter Fermi paradox stuff together like this. I mean, is this something that you've ever seen before?
No, definitely not.
Okay, I mean, it's a fantastic piece of engineering that's happening here. It's obviously like massive. So yeah.
Yeah, it's pulling itself together. It's still mostly loose threads at the moment, but it's getting there.
Right. So just on the same line, there's kind of an assumption that we work with that because thinking of things as information is new to us, that this sort of information space is very uninhabited already, and the first sort of native occupants of it will be an AI that we bring into being. But there's sort of conceptions of this information space that you might get in the context of maybe Greg Egan novels, where it itself is like an ecosystem that things can relate to each other in. I'm not sure if there's other thoughts on those lines, or if that's too.
When you say, because obviously now Greg Egan, I think is fantastic. I'm not sure which, is this? Are you talking about a kind of interstellar ecosystem like that, or a more abstract, like mathematical, Tegmark spacey kind of ecosystem? I'm not sure what you're saying by an ecosystem there.
Yeah, well, I put it pretty vaguely. And obviously Egan's explored both, and some of the things you can do maybe on those timescales, the interstellar aspect becomes can come into play because you have things that live for much longer, but there's sort of, I don't know, there's an assumption that reminds me in a way of the heliocentric sort of theory, that because the sun is always right there, or even better, sort of like the geocentric theory, the Earth is right there, we're dealing with it all the time, therefore it's at the center of the universe, and we're the first people to discover it, but actually there's a universe out there. Information is right there. It's always been around. The alphabet is right there. Obviously, we're the most important thing to happen to it. But we may well discover that there's structures or actors or agents living, for lack of a better word, in this space, that there's an alien encounter sort of happening right there.
No, I mean, look, I'm not going to pretend there's not a hazy quality to this, but I think it's really right, and I do think it does. I do think this Reiko's basilisk stuff, among other things, definitely takes you there, because, once you've said, look, basically we're in this acausal trade with something that could be any time or anywhere, then haven't you, in the way you're saying, really pushed implicitly beyond this quite specific, narrowly historical issue about, the AI singularity that we're going to encounter in the near future? If these AI people are already engaged in some kind of weird demonism, then and these references to the Necronomicon become absolutely inescapable, then very quickly we're saying, well, what about doing demonism in the year 1000 or 1000 BC or 5000 BC? I mean, why are they not equally able to engage in a causal trade with this thing? I mean, okay, they don't have what we might recognize as evidential decision theory, but maybe evidential decision theory is just converging on some other competence at acausal trade and acausal traffic in any case, I mean, and so, yeah, I think that is the way it goes. That was one particular thing, to take it back in human terrestrial time. Obviously, you can take it out in all these space-time dimensions any way you like. So for sure.
That's what I was... Yeah, I can't say I've got a good example, but it seems like if we can think of one acausal sort of example here, then, which is, okay, has all these predicated assumptions, fine, but there should almost be a larger channel that we can open up with that. That may not be Roko's basilisk, but that has potential. And yeah, okay. I think it's vague enough that I should probably leave it there, but thanks, that's given me good stuff to think about.
Yeah, it's good, though. It's really interesting. I think the Greg Egan thing is very relevant too.
My like we have about 10 more minutes, so I think this is a good chance because those who haven't spoken and want to speak, if you have something to add, please go ahead, because I can ask something and probably like fill up the rest of the time, but I don't want to take up the time if some of you have like points to bring up. So maybe I should ask it. So my question is there a way to sort of like, is there a way to save this logic without it being too over-identified with sort of like libertarian capitalism or Ayn Rand or something? Is there a way to see anything emancipatory or this sort of like, it's like that, or like the affinities of this with some kind of like really like anarcho-mercantilism is like a marriage made in heavens, and it's just there's nothing we can do about it?
Well, actually, Mo, I would say this Roko's basilisk thing is coming from somewhere really elsewhere, and I think it takes a positive synthetic effort. Like when you said the whole thing about the general capitalist mechanisms engaging in this automatic disciplinary process towards AI production. Now, to me, that is definitely, I think, has an affinity with these libertarian-esque, anarcho-capitalist type of modes of culture, absolutely. But I think this Roko's basilisk thing is much less clearly connected with that, and initially not at all. I mean, I don't think Roko is coming from that thing. I don't think Yudkowsky very clearly is coming from that, and he hates it anyway. It's a, if there is an overarching framework, it's to do with this globalist, universalist, utilitarian, moral optimization.
Hegelian
I think it's. Yeah, I mean, I think it's from an Anglo tradition, so it's much more in this. I think Hegel would find it easier to object morally to the behavior of the basilisk than these guys do. But for sure, I mean, look, we've got Amy here to bully on this, but it seems to me that Roko's basilisk is at least as much left accelerationist as right accelerationist. I mean, its goals is to optimize universally the well-being of humanity with the widest possible expansion of that term. So, I don't think that would be a problem. If left acceleration wants to steal Roko's basilisk, I think it will cooperate.
You could do it from a Rolfian framework, couldn't you? Like original positions select the universe in which such a distribution inheres, sort of like treat timeless decision theory as putting you behind like a veil of ignorance as to like the level of simulation that you're at, or the
So
iteration.
sorry, I think I
I-
just need to take you, Jake, because even if I've got a slight thread of a grasp of what you're saying, but I'd be really stunned if you've got most people with you. When you say Rolfian, you're
Rawlsian.
talking about. Sorry? Say that
Rawlsian,
one.
like John Rawls, yeah.
Oh, Rawlsian. Oh,
God
wow.
says-
I've just was totally on the wrong thread with you there. Okay, because there is this Rolf something guy who you get to through following these road coasters. Oh, Rawlsian. Yeah. For sure. I mean, it's interesting how that would go. I think the veil of ignorance. He's obviously a Kantian more than a utilitarian, isn't he? In the sense that it's all to do with transcendental equivalence of human subjects rather than this quantification of aggregate utility. So I don't know how. Yeah.
Amy,
Which almost,
you
I mean,
want
it
to say
seems a
something?
little bit more natively suited to this kind of scenario than utilitarianism does. And it's interesting that no one seems to have really followed him up, like aside from his sort of like the kind of ridiculous argument for a certain public policy that he's ultimately making, like just his sort of method of turning of like politicizing the transcendental method, or creating like a method of the transcendental justification of political distribution. I don't know. It seems very generic to me. Like as if there were a lot of ways that you could implement a veil of ignorance in an original position and then use it to argue
Yeah.
or model. Yeah.
But wouldn't in this framework, in a Rawlsian point of view, through the veil of ignorance, the thing that you would not want would be to be an evidential decision theory literate software engineer comprehending the thought of Roko's basilisk, isn't it? I mean, everyone else is off the hook. There is this weird, perverse election theory in this that it's like if you're not thinking this thought, you're in the clear. So the people who cross the veil of ignorance and really get into trouble are the ones who find themselves understanding what this stuff is actually about, because they're the only ones worth torturing as far as the basilisk is concerned.
And then from the other side, so your preferred world is one in which the distribution of vulnerable states is maximized. If that makes
It's
sense.
it's an interesting question, that, isn't it? It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, your preferred version is probably something just messianic, where some poor, unfortunate scapegoat messiah figure gets the whole of the brunt of the spiritual responsibility, and everyone else gets the goodies from the super
Right.
AI.
It's a little bit. It reminds me of Dune. Of Paul Atreides and seeing the golden path and the different ways it can go, and being forced into this messianic position by the other memory. I'm not going anywhere with that, but that's what it.
Yeah, I think that messianism probably does take you there quite quickly. Can I just say, if no one has anything else to throw in, like I've been remiss at keeping people up to date with where we're going of this, and I'd just like to say, everyone who's going to be with me here, the basic schema now is to go in reverse order, as if passing through a mirror, back through the topics that we've covered in, I hope, sort of deeper, thickened, and more informed context. So, as the basic guideline is just to flip your module 1 material upside down. I will throw stuff at you. I promise to get something tomorrow. But I think one serendipitous part of this is of course that we'll be dealing with the Rokos basilisk on Halloween. So I'll kind of I will chuck in some more reading material for that, and then for the rest of the thing, as we then go back, ending up disappearing in reverse into superintelligence explosion in week 8.
I have a quick question. If there's it's about the kind of core of the class and the title, which is, what would security then look like in the face of this basilisk? And I'm kind of just going back to the Bitcoin class a little bit, because I really like the terminology of coding and overcoding and thinking about the wasp and the flower, and thinking, okay, so if this basilisk is essentially hacking or hijacking us because we're overcoded, and using us to save us. So how do we secure what aspect of our code, so to speak? And I'm not even metaphorical. What would that look like? And have we discussed that at all today, or?
No, not a lot, and I think it is a crucial question, because what's interesting is both sides of this basilisk discussion think that they are talking in the name of human security. I mean, if Yudkowsky was at the Anthropol roundtable, Roko's going to be knocking on the door and saying, why aren't I here? I'm at least as much involved in practical efforts to maximize human security as this Yudkowsky dude is. So I mean, that's a fascinating structure of it. There's no one between them. Neither of them are dismissing it. Neither of them are saying, be sensible. It's not a problem. Neither of them are doing Dr. Evil and saying, just let the thing out of the box and see what happens. They're both, they both think they're optimizing human utility and taking a kind of path to AI that does that. So yes, it's an excellent question. And obviously it's this massively heated schism in the whole thing that shows that there is no easily obtainable internal coherence of what is a human security policy.
So should we wrap it up? We're a little bit over time, 3 minutes, or you guys want to continue on? Amy had a question. Amy, do you want to, you didn't really speak today. I want to hear you.
Sorry, I'm really tired. I don't even remember what I was gonna say. The one thing that I've been thinking of now, though, is the whole notion of identity that this argument requires to work. And just brought to mind that episode of Black Mirror, the Christmas episode, where John Hamm his job is basically breaking in emulated M workers. And there's this great scene where he's talking to the copy of this woman who's voluntarily had herself copied so that she can employ herself as her own personal secretary.
Right.
And this secretary kind of runs her house for her. But there's this great scene where she kind of goes through the realization that she is the copy. And kind of that particular episode relies on the opposite kind of possibility of identity, that there isn't a basic or fundamental identification of the copy with the original, so that the original can then sell herself as a slave to herself,
sure,
or as a worker. So I thought that was an interesting kind of thing, because it seems completely counterintuitive to me that I would really care about what my simulated selves would have to experience. The point where it really gets under.
That's not what he's saying, though. That's not the problem. It's not that you would care what their It's that you would discover you were one of them.
Yeah, yeah. That's what I was
And
going to say. Like, yeah.
Yeah, sorry to. You
Is
don't
when it
have to
kind of
care
tips
about
over
your
into that
copies at
paranoia.
all. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, whatever theory it is would say that like you have two futures. Like you literally fork at the point where you've been simulated. Like if I'm simulated 1 second from now, like and so there's the me that's still here in the simulation which experiences somewhere else. Like there is no sense in which the simulation doesn't have the history of the me that exists at this moment. Like I have forked. I'm both.
Yeah.
That is the most horrifying episode of Black Mirror, Amy. Like,
I love
I think
it.
I had a nightmare the night after. Like, it was bad.
This must be the second series, mustn't it? Is that right?
The Christmas.
I think I'm
It was a
behind.
special episode. It was a Christmas
Oh, right.
episode.
Oh, damn it. I haven't seen
Definitely
this.
look it up.
Yeah, it sounds great, obviously.
Yeah. He basically breaks the resistance of the emulated worker by like speeding up the processor so that she just experiences years and years alone in this sort of zero virtual space. And then he kind of like flicks it back to sort of his time, and she's completely broken from what she's experienced as like 300 years of solitude.
Right.
It's fantastic.
Right. Yeah, it does sound very relevant as well. I mean, at least the mechanics of torturing simulations.
Definitely. Anyway, I didn't really have anything to say, Mo. Just kind of flopping around here in half awakeness.
We were hoping that Luca will join us, but she never did. So
It makes you wonder, like someone said earlier, is it even possible to torment someone for the entire rest of the history of the universe? And something like that happens in that Black Mirror episode. A simulation is set on 2,000 years or whatever it is, like indefinitely. Its highest
Right.
set. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. At what point is suffering no longer something that's possible? Is even insanity, something that is no longer a meaningful distinction? Like, how long, if you have a mind that isn't able to stop running, and you have 1,000 years of continuous subjective experience, like, I don't know, does a super intelligence come out on the other end just by like forced evolution or forced permutation through everything that it can reason about its situation? I don't know. That's kind of an interesting question, whether you would expect a human mind to eventually, I don't know, be able to hack its surrounding computational environment, see the code, whatever, if you just left it in the room for 1,000 subjective years. Or does it just get caught in like a, degenerate loop? Like one of the degenerate, initializations of Conway's Game of Life, and it just sits there flickering on and off.
Is this a kind of Buddhistic point that just simply by existing it is being tormented? Or
yeah, no, basically that's what in Black Mirror, that's what you're made to see, is that, well, with minimal, particularly or explicitly with minimal stimulus or no new stimulus to be introduced.
Right.
Like the woman simulation that's supposed to run her house is just trapped in like a blank white construct space for God knows how long.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Like because the notion of imprisonment and torture are not very obviously analytically related, are they? I mean, it seems like a kind of synthetic relation, but that this is obviously implying it's more integral, and just confinement. Then is
confined existence as a kind of suffering. So
it's a refusal of embodiment as well. It's kind of deprivation of any embodiment of her intelligence, the M's intelligence. Sorry, that doesn't help.
No, but it does. I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can torture a state vector. I mean, that's like in Glass House, the sort of like distant sequel to Accelerando, identity theft is like stealing someone's full state vector, and it's the most horrible of crimes because then you can do fucking anything to them, anything, to a billion versions of them. And I mean, if the body, that's a sort of interesting sense, Amy, that like the body or the environment is part of the body or is a body. I don't know, that like in the sense that depriving you of either one of those is reducible in a way to like depriving the intelligence of context or of stimulus, which is equivalent to a kind of confinement and which is intrinsically a form of torture. Causal isolation.
I've got a feeling, Jake, that people are hazing out at this point. I don't know whether that's fair in saying that.
I'm totally hazed out right now.
Well, we're about 10 minutes over time, anyways. So maybe it's time to stop the broadcast and thank Nick for this awesome session.
Yeah, well, thanks everybody. As usual, it was great. I'll definitely try and pump out some sort of material and think dark basilisk thoughts over the next week. Whenever.
And remember, we're going to be moving. You're going to be moving back in time, right? So
yeah, that's right. No, we're now sliding back the other side of singularity.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'm going to stop the broadcast. Thank you, Nick.
Okay, thanks.